Doke. Good luck, Lucas.
Hi, my name is Lucas Thompson. My topic here today is privacy between open source and proprietary software. So first off, proprietary software is software where the source code is not publicly available. It's the opposite of open source software, that software where the source code is publicly available. Anyone can access it, copy it, do whatever you want with it, really. So how did we get here? Why this topic? Why is it important to me? More importantly, why should it be important for you as well? Well, for me, it all started years ago when I started getting into technology and reading tech news. And I started noticing all these different news stories of different privacy violations. You can see here a Google search result for digital privacy violations pulls up 56 million search results. It felt like these privacy violations were everywhere. It felt like I just couldn't get away from all of this. So we had this problem that the software I was using wasn't aligning with my privacy needs. And for me, the solution to that problem was alternative software choices. Things like I would use DuckDuckGo instead of Google, Firefox instead of Google Chrome, Linux instead of Windows. And I started to notice an interesting trend among all of these changes, where I was often going from proprietary software over to open source software. The open source alternative was always the more private, the more secure, the more responsible with your data option. And thinking about this relationship is what brought me to my research question. What does the difference in privacy between open source and proprietary software convey to American consumers and software developers? This is kind of a compounding question. There's really two parts to it. There's this first part where we need to first prove that there is a difference between open source and proprietary software before we can move on to discussing what that conveys to American consumers and software developers. So let's move on to the body of research, specifically two sources that were integral to my research. First is from Corinne Tan. She examined 6 terms of service agreements and read them for how they lined up with copyright law. And she also examined how user behavior on these platforms might lead to accidental copyright violations. Now, the important part is here, her examination of TOS, which tells me that analyzing TOS is something worth doing. I wasn't sure if this was something worth doing. I had another source that said that somewhere around 95% of people don't even read TOS, so I wasn't sure if pulling information from this was going to actually mean anything. She also performed all of her analysis using a self-defined set of criteria. The reason she is able to do this is because she is a PhD in law and is an experienced media law researcher. I am neither of these things, and I have my own biases, so I needed a more objective framework to base my analysis off of, and that's where the...
Oh, Jesus.
There it is. All right. That is where the digital standard comes in. The digital standard is basically a set of frameworks among all these different categories you can see down there, designed for companies to examine their own software to see, are we meeting these? For my research, I care about the privacy criteria. Here is a list of all the privacy criteria. You do not need to read all of this. This is just here so you can get an idea of what kinds of things that the digital standard actually is examining for. What you do need to understand is the sort of hierarchy that it has. So there's all these different criterias. Each criteria has a set of indicators for the criteria to see, is it meeting the criteria? The indicators all have their own test to see, does this indicator exist within the terms of service? It's somewhat complicated. So, all in all, from the body of research, we get 2 important things. We learned that analyzing TOS is something valid and worth doing, and we have a framework that we can do our analysis off of. We know what we're going to be looking at, and we know what we're going to be looking for. With all this said, let's finally move on to my research. So, I first needed to actually select the terms of service agreements that I was going to be looking at. For proprietary software, I selected Photoshop, Google Chrome, Microsoft Office, Twitter, and Discord. For open source software, I selected Krita, Firefox, LibreOffice, Mastodon, and Telegram. These were all selected because of their popularity and relevance to my study, similar to how Tan selected her sources. Additionally, you'll recall I mentioned the tests for the indicators given by the digital standard earlier. These tests are extremely vague, which is where the digital standard handbook comes in. It goes through each criteria, each indicator, and provides much more in-depth details on how to test for these indicators, and more importantly, it also provides scoring criteria. Now, a problem this introduces is that the Digital Standard Handbook does not appear to be entirely up to date. Not every criteria, not every indicator is within the Digital Standard Handbook. So you can see these crossed out criteria are ones that are not with it, that I could not test for because they're not in the Digital Standard Handbook. There's a couple under other indicators across the other criteria that are also not there. Originally, there was 31 indicators underneath all of the privacy criteria. I could only test for 20 because there was only 20 within the Digital Standard Handbook. We'll talk more about what that means for the results later on. I also created a Google form to help streamline the process. Going through 10 terms of service agreements is a lot of data, so I needed a clear and obvious place where all of the data is centralized, so that way I know where everything is, and when I go back for analysis, everything is easier. You can see some of the questions I asked, like what indicator is this, what's the criteria, how did it score, what does the TOS actually say, those sorts of things. So let's run through an example of the methodology. This is from the first criteria. It is the fourth indicator, basically asking that it is clear that a user can opt out of targeted advertising. There's a lot here, but what matters is this part. If the legal documents provide a list of how users' information will be shared, and that list does not include sharing of information for purposes of advertising, mark pass. So let's look at this screenshot from Firefox TOS. Again, there's a lot here, but even from just a scan through, we can see you don't see the words targeted advertising anywhere. However, we share your information with others for processing or providing products and services to you, but only if those entities receiving your information are contractually obligated to handle the data in ways that are approved by Mozilla. This sounds like it could be fluffed up speech for targeted advertisement, but we know from other parts of the TOS and how Mozilla tends to phrase things, this is essentially Firefox sharing information with itself and necessary information with the websites you visit. So don't think, what kind of products does this user like? Think, what language is this device running? With all of that, we can comfortably mark a pass for this indicator, indicated in the top right. What this means is that Firefox will receive 2 points for its total score, scoring 2 out of 2 possible points for this indicator. We then repeat this process for every indicator for every TOS agreement. Again, this is a lot of data to sift through, which highlights the necessity of that Google form. Tan, a much more experienced researcher, only looked at 6 TOS agreements. I'm looking at 10, and I only have about a month to go through all of the information. This streamlining of the process allows me to process this much data within my timeline. With all that being said, let's move on to the final results. So here's a table of all of the data I collected. These bottom 2 represent the combined scores of all open source and all proprietary, open source, proprietary respectively. Each product can score a total possible of 40 points, and each of these 2 software types can score a total possible score of 200. The greatest possible mean score is 2. Here we have a graph of the mean scores. If the bar is in red, that means the product is open source. If the bar is in blue, that means the product is proprietary. Here is a similar graph with the total scores of the products. And with these graphs, we can start to notice an interesting trend where proprietary is consistently lower than open source. We can see that there's a sizable margin between open source and proprietary, but we don't know how much of a difference this is, if this difference is statistically significant. So we conduct a 2-sample t-test for the difference in means. Our null hypothesis is that mu1 is equal to mu2. Our alternative hypothesis is that mu1 is greater than mu2. Essentially what this means is that we're assuming that there is not going to be a difference in the mean scores between open source and proprietary, but we're trying to prove that open source does score higher because that is our hypothesis. After doing the calculations, I got a t-score of 8.6939 and this extremely low p-value. So here we have a t-distribution, and basically what the t-distribution is the probability that we collected this data assuming the null hypothesis is true. You can see that there's a lot of data here by the mean. What these numbers represent is the standard deviation. Our t-score is how many standard deviations away from the mean we are. Our data is 8.6939 standard deviations away from the mean. And the amount of data on the graph will tell us the probability that we collect this data assuming the null hypothesis is true, which when you see a p-value that small, that's effectively a value of 0, which means the p-value is our probability of collecting this data, which means that our probability, assuming the null hypothesis is true, is effectively 0. Thus, we can reject the null hypothesis in favor of the alternative hypothesis and state that yes, open source software scores higher than proprietary software, indicating a higher level of privacy. So let's move on to conclusions. Going back to the research question, we've answered the first part of this. Now we can move on to the second part, what this conveys for American consumers and software developers. For American consumers, this information can help them better identify their privacy needs. Digital privacy is something that's not very well taught. A lot of people don't really know what they want in this regard. So something like the digital standard can give people an idea of what kinds of things are out there, what kinds of things they should be looking out for. It can also help them identify software that meets their privacy needs. If there's a specific criteria or a specific set of indicators that I really care about, I can look to software that scores high in these areas so that software better matches my privacy needs. Alternatively, they can completely disregard this information. Digital privacy is just not something that everyone cares about. If you look at this and say that this is just not something that interests me, then that's great. Anytime someone tries to pitch software to you, pitch software to you based off of the privacy of it, you can safely disregard that information. For software developers, it helps identify the strengths and weaknesses of both their own software and the competition. For example, if I'm a Microsoft Office developer and I see that LibreOffice scored 39 out of 40 possible points, I might say, okay, we need to work on the privacy of our software so that we can stay competitive in the marketplace. Alternatively, if I'm a LibreOffice developer, I can say, hey, we are leagues ahead of the competition in this regard. Let's focus development on other areas so that we can stay competitive. In general, open source scores higher, which indicates a higher level of privacy. A lot of the body of research that I did not talk about in this presentation was very solution-oriented. So I wanted to note that open source software, the proliferation of it, could be a potential solution for digital privacy problems. So let's talk about some limitations. As previously mentioned, the Digital Standard Handbook is missing certain criteria and indicators. This means that we are not testing for all of privacy, which is why you may notice earlier I did not say that open source is better than proprietary for privacy. I said it scores higher, which indicates a higher level of privacy. Because I'm not comfortable making the assertion that it is better for privacy when we haven't examined for all facets of privacy. Additionally, some of the criteria within the handbook are very niche and obtuse. This is from the sixth criteria, the first indicator, basically saying that when a user stops using a service, their information will be deleted. But it also says this: if the legal documents indicate that personal information is deleted within a reasonable time frame of the service ceasing operations, mark pass. Nobody received this point because nobody is going to be planning for when they go out of business. Because if you as a company are planning for when you go out of business, that means you think you're going to go out of business. This was the one and only point that LibreOffice did not receive because it just doesn't make sense for it to be there. Additionally, the TOS agreements themselves are often very hard to read. They're very archaic, they're very vague. Here's an example from the Google Chrome TOS. This is a section that talks about what information is collected. And it includes things such as purchase activity, people with whom you communicate or share content, and activity on third-party sites and apps that use our services. I could have assumed that Google Chrome was already collecting this information. The things they're telling me are so vague that I've effectively learned nothing about what information is actually being collected here. From Microsoft Office TOS, we also use the data to operate our business, which includes analyzing our performance, meeting our legal obligations, developing our workforce, and doing research. What does doing research mean? Is Microsoft conducting studies using my data? Can I opt out of this? What information is included in this? These are all questions that just go unanswered due to the vagueness of TOS. However, TOS agreements are only sometimes hard to read. For example, LibreOffice here was very well written. This is just some general information about data processing. We collect and use personal information from our users only to the extent necessary to provide a functional website, content, and services. Okay, that's pretty clear. It also will go further and tell me what law gives them the legal basis to collect this information. As you can see, it is much more comprehensible, much easier to read. To any TOS authors, please look to LibreOffice as an example of what your TOS should look like. Finally, here are my references.
Thank you. We have your oral defense questions. We're going to start on that end and work our way down.
All right, let's see. How did the choices you made when designing or implementing your research method impact your research process?
So as I mentioned in the presentation, 10 TOS agreements is a lot of data to sift through, especially when a lot of the other body of research is only looking at numbers like 6 TOS agreements with TON. So I think implementing the Google form was a very, very important step in the process, because having that centralized place for all of the data to exist, by the time I went back for data analysis, it made things so much easier, so much smoother. I could go through it all much quicker, which allowed me to complete this entire process in my given time frame.
Thank you.
All right. How did your findings provide direction for future research in the field?
So, first off, Corinne Ton, her methodology, I think, is very good. It should be used a lot more, but I noticed very few researchers actually look to TOS agreements for information about products, despite TOS being the rules that dictate how the product operates. Additionally, I also think the digital standard should be used more. None of the sources I looked at used the digital standard, when I think that examining TOS for the different criteria under the digital standard that are not just privacy is also worth doing.
Okay. And if you could revisit your research process, what would you do differently and why?
I am a very goal-oriented person, is how I would word it. At the beginning of this process, I frankly did not have much of an idea of what my end product would look like, and I think that's something that I very much need. So if I could go back in time to the beginning of my research process, I would put more time and effort into thinking about, what do I want this to look like when I'm finished with everything? I think that would have been helpful for me to understand what I'm working towards throughout the entire process.
Okay. Thank you.